life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw the right conclusion. Let them be still.
Welcome to episode number 99 of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast showcasing the wide range of perspectives and ideas throughout antinatalism as it exists today, through interviews with anti-natalist and non-antinatalist thinkers and creators of all kinds, now running 5 years strong. I'm your host, Amanda Sukenick, and today I'm speaking with the director of the Neo-Manichean Church, the Ecclesia of Light, Oscar Manzano.
Manichaeism, from Wikipedia. Manichaeism is a Gnostic former major world religion founded in the 3rd century CEE by the Parthian prophet Mani 274 CE in the Sasanian Empire. Manichaeism teaches an elaborate dualistic cosmology describing the struggle between a good spiritual world of light and an evil, material world of darkness. Through an ongoing process that takes place in human history, light is gradually removed from the world of matter and returned to the world of light, whence it came. Mani's teaching was intended to combine, succeed, and surpass the teachings of Platonism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Marcionism, Hellenistic and Rabbinic Judaism, Gnostic movements, ancient Greek religion, Babylonian and other Mesopotamian religions, and mystery cults. It reveres Mani as the final prophet after Zoroaster, the Buddha, and Jesus. Manichaeism was quickly successful and spread far through Aramaic-speaking regions. It thrived between the 3rd and 7th centuries, and at its height was one of the most widespread religions in the world. Manichaean churches and scriptures existed as far east as China and as far west as the Roman Empire. It was briefly the main rival to early Christianity in the competition to replace classical polytheism before the spread of Islam. Under the Roman dominate, Manichaeism was persecuted by the Roman state and was eventually stamped out in the Roman Empire. Manichaeism survived longer in the East than it did in the West. Although it was thought to have finally faded away after the 14th century in South China, contemporary to the decline of the Church of the East in Ming China, there is a growing corpus of evidence that shows Manichaeism persists in some areas of China, especially in Fujian, where numerous Manichaean relics have been discovered over time. The currently known sects are notably secretive and protective of their belief system in an effort to remain undetected. This stems from fears relating to persecution and suppression during various periods of Chinese history. While most of Manichaeism's original writings have been lost, numerous translations and fragmentary texts have survived.
Welcome, Oscar, to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. It's an honor and a delight to have you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Happy to be here.
Oscar, as you may or may not know, contemporary antinatalism didn't begin properly until around 2006 with the publication of South African philosopher David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. But long before that, antinatalist-like thinking, in one description or another, can be found throughout history, and in a great many world historical religions. In Judaism, we can, for instance, find in the Talmud the phrase, "It would have been preferable had man not been created than to have been created." And even in the Bible itself, there are quite a number of examples of antinatalist-like quotes. There's Luke 23:29. "For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear, and the paps that never gave suck." Or another example would be Ecclesiastes. "And I declare that the dead who are already dead are happier than the living who are still alive, but better than both is the one that has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun." And we can also find examples in Buddhism. There have been a number of books that have kind of detailed this. This is From Benatar to Buddhism by Ken Coates. This is another sort of rare book, The Hinayana Buddha, the First Antinatalist by Daniel Delanoux. So there's some literature out there about the connections between Buddhism and antinatalism. One other example is Child-Free Christ by Théophile Diderot. Prima Kerma's Anti-natalismus. This details all kinds of different antinatalist-like sects that have been out there. And there's even been a book like Martin Smith's No Baby, No Cry, which, as the back of the book details was written specifically for contemporary Christian antinatalists.
Mhm.
Now, again, contemporary antinatalism, and most certainly the antinatalism that I was first exposed to and know and love, is marked by rather ardent atheism. So to
Mhm.
learn that, in fact, antinatalism has also had these connections to religion, and a long and actually rather tremendous history within world religions, is something that I've always found to be extremely fascinating and exciting. The idea that antinatalism can span those sorts of diametrically opposed lines between believers and non-believers. And I think that's an incredibly important fact that deserves a lot more study than it's received.
Mhm.
So Oscar, I've been waiting to interview somebody who identifies as some kind or another of religious-based antinatalism for
Mhm.
over a decade now, really. But quite honestly, it's very hard to find people who are willing to have that discussion. So let's start off with the basics. Who is Oscar? And when you tell me that, can you also tell me a little bit about who Mani was, what Manichaeanism is, and what
Sure.
brought you to this faith? Yeah.
So, I'm only 20, so just for the record. But I got interested in Manichaeism around 2 years ago, like right before I turned 18. Um, and the thing that actually like brought me to it is obviously I'm a big reader. So I was reading Candide by Voltaire, and in that book there's a character who refers to himself as a Manichaean, and I was like, what is that? I've never seen that term before. So from there I started looking into what Manichaeism actually was, and it sort of just resonated with me, I guess. I also looked into some other religions like Valentinianism, but that would have been my second choice, but it just didn't resonate quite the same. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of how I got introduced to it. As for like who Mani is, he was a third century prophet. Um, and I mean he was an artist, he was a writer, he was very prolific in his writing. He wrote 7 books, I believe, which most of which are lost now, unfortunately, but we're working on that. We're bringing them back. There's surprisingly a lot of Manichaean text that's still around, more so than people give credit for. So that should hopefully be changing. Let's see, what else did he do? He traveled a lot. He got the support of King Shapur, and that generally allowed him to really set up the foundation of his religion relatively unencumbered, uh, which was great. But eventually, that king died, and a later on king, Bahram, ended up killing Mani and flaying him because that's the nice thing to do when you don't agree with somebody's religious faith. um, but yeah, and then obviously Manichaeism has continued relatively it continued till about the 15th century, where after around then it started basically going, it was practically gone. Today's there's still some Chinese Manichaeans, which is called Mingjiao. um, but at this point they are very far removed from what a Manichaean or what Manichaeism originally was, that they are practically more Buddhist than Manichaean at this point. But if you want something really interesting to try and find a Chinese Manichaean to talk to. They're hard to find. I've only ever talked to one, and that was it. And that was like a momentous occasion. Um, but yeah, so they're still active. There's one active temple, and then there's the stuff that myself and others are trying to do, where we're trying to kind of bring it back to how it originally was, or a little bit more orthodox. I personally don't think that there's a possible way to bring it back to like a fully like pure form of Manichaeism, just because there were a lot of texts lost, and that structure hasn't existed, and the modern world is very different. So kind of have to adapt that a little bit.
And I'd like to ask you more about the Chinese existent Manichaeans later on. We'll get to that for sure.
Absolutely.
Oscar, why are you or are you not an antinatalist?
Okay, so I personally do want kids. So the interesting thing about Manichaeism in regards to antinatalism is, so the elect, right, which are like the holy class, or like kind of like the priests, if you want to equate those to like Christianity, they were not allowed to have children. So they were in particular really the ones that were encouraged to be antinatalist slash required to be antinatalist to be in that position. Um, Interestingly, though, there were elect that had previously had children, and then became an elect later. And then also there was the practice, I don't remember quite what the term is, but there were hearers, which are like the laity, right? They would donate basically their kid into becoming an elect later on, which I thought was really interesting. So I'm not entirely sure if Manichaeism is fully 100% anti-natalist, but I do know for sure that the elect were in fact anti-natalist. I think for the hearers, it was more of like you shouldn't do that, but if you do, then okay. Um, Kind of like the same with eating meat. So in Manichaeism, there's a lot of emphasis on vegetarianism. So the hearers are allowed to eat meat under the condition that they did not kill the creature themselves, or like so that if they bought it or if they were gifted it, that's fine. Just so long as you don't kill it yourself. That was like the line in the sand that was drawn there. Um, so yeah, I think that's
Yeah, I mean, so there was, so what we would call that, I think, is essentially a type of conditional antinatalism. So it's not a universal sort of principle of, nobody should have kids.
yeah.
But do you think that, like, with so many texts missing, we don't really know, right? I mean, there may have, would you do you get any kind of sense from the existing texts that we have that there was some sort of hope that everybody would become an elect at some point, or did there was there a need, was there an absolute, need for every to have those two classes at all times, so that some children would be produced somehow?
Yeah, so I think that the ideal was everybody becomes an elect, everybody becomes saved. Um, but in the real world, that would have never have happened because people sin, people exist and do things, and that, it happens. Whatever. So realistically, impossible to do. So there would have been that absolute requirement for both classes because the hearers essentially their job, so to speak, was to facilitate the elect to to be elect, especially back then because the elect weren't allowed to work. They had to like move around a lot. They weren't allowed to own a lot of things, which incidentally is probably why the elect today would probably have to be a little bit different because you can't exactly have your priestly class going around getting murdered and being homeless. That's probably not anyway. Um, but yeah, so back then it was definitely a requirement for both um, classes to exist. But there is one Manichaean text in particular that I can think of that could indicate more anti-natalistic, tendencies. So there is essentially like an equivalent to Genesis, but for Manichaeism. It's called On the Beginning of Generation, and one of the texts in the Shabragan, actually. Um, but in that text, it talks about Adam and Eve and whatnot, and it talks about how essentially Adam was like reprimanded and very discouraged and taught to fear Eve so that he wouldn't go and talk to her because apparently Eve was also sinful. So, incidentally, some interesting stuff that happens there. I guess it was inevitable that more people were going to exist because in it there is a essentially one of the demons has a child with Eve, and then that child has more children with Eve. Yeah, so a little incestual stuff going on there, but whatever. Um, and Adam eventually does have a child with Eve, because he's essentially tempted into it by magic, the use of magic. Um, so in that text, I can sort of see, an argument like, okay, he was told not to do this. So clearly he's not supposed to go reproducing. He's not supposed to go have kids. Um, so there's absolutely that sort of interpretation, especially because Adam, even though he did have kids later on, he did get saved in the end. So that's another example of like, okay, you did do this, but you still get saved eventually. So you can definitely kind of make an argument either way there, I think. And that's the case with a few other, there's some touchy Manichaean subjects where there have been people that are kind of back and forth. I personally, I try to kind of walk the middle of those different perspectives so that I can kind of make both work cohesively. But yeah, so that's one of the more touchy things, I think.
Would you say that the issue of procreation in general, the whole antinatalism or not issue, is one of those sort of touchy subjects in Manichaeanism? How do you feel that that particular subject is perceived by contemporary Manichaeans?
Okay, well, I know a few people, but the thing is with a lot of Manichaeans around today, nobody's born into it, okay? Like you choose to become it. So the thing that happens is those people tend to carry some baggage with them. So for instance, somebody who does have kids is probably not going to view antinatalism in the most positive light necessarily, or there's different examples of that, but sometimes people will carry over their views. Like if they were affiliated with a previous religion, then they become Manichaean. Chances are they're going to carry some of that over and kind of incorporate it into Manichaeism because it's a very adaptable religion. So that's actually something that is conceivable to do. So it kind of comes down to personal bias. My general like the way I view it is that the elect absolutely have to be anti-natalist. They can't have kids. That's like a requirement. If they had kids before, whatever, that's fine. If the hearers decided to have kids, all right. But it's the Manichaean modern church, in my opinion, should neither endorse nor reprimand having kids, essentially. So kind of just take a neutral stance on that since we don't entirely know where that stands for, the general people.
Are there, like, in the contemporary Manichaean church now, whether it be in the Chinese context or what you've worked on, are there people that are elect and
There are not yet.
not yet? Okay.
Not yet. Because the thing is with that is there's only about 20 something Manichaeans, give or take, which, hey, it's better than nothing considering there's not been really anything going on there for, a few centuries now. Um, but because of that, there have not really been any elect. I personally plan to become an elect eventually one day, but that's not going to be for a while because I'm 20 and I still have stuff. I need my time to go sin and whatnot. So, um, but yeah, so eventually I'll become an elect, but probably not for a little while. But I'm very, I guess, learned in the different like Manichaean texts. Like I've um studied and reread them like 3 or 4 times by now. So I have a pretty good idea of how Manichaeism generally works, but I am personally not an elect yet. Um, there was somebody who was relatively close to becoming an elect. He was going to try to, but it didn't go anywhere. Maybe he will again in the future. I don't know, but as of now, there is no official, elect. Um, but in Chinese Manichaeism too, there's not elect either. What they have is a what is it called? Ritual master. That's what they have now. They have a ritual master, which is not the same. So that's another thing about the Chinese Manichaeans is they don't actually have any elect either. They have somewhere in between a hearer and elect. They have a ritual master. So they're a little different, but I appreciate the fact that they have managed to survive this long. You know.
Well, let me ask now, in regards to the ones in the Chinese context. I mean, are we talking about people that are they blood descendants of historical ancient Manichaeans, or are they themselves sort of picked it up ideologically through some other means? And I know that they're like, as you said, it's very sort of mixed with Buddhism and sort of folk religions
Religions,
too.
yes.
It's sort of a conglomerate of different things now. But I mean, has that sort of lineage, whether it be by blood or whatever, been sort of traced?
So I would assume that at least some of them are actually descended from Manichaeans because that just kind of makes sense, especially like because there can exist natalist Manichaeans. Actually, the one Chinese Manichaean that I've spoken to, he is a natalist Manichaean. He was born into that. He didn't, convert to it. Um, so there are definitely probably some, you know, descendants of Manichaeans in there. Uh, but it's interesting, really. But I've only talked to the one, so I don't really know. I would also assume that there have been different people who have converted to it or married into it, that sort of thing, at some point. Um, but kind of a mix of both, I would say.
No, I'm jumping around all over the place a bit, but would you mind telling me a little bit more about the Manichaean concept of dualism?
Okay, so let me try and think of how I can kind of simplify it a bit. So the Manichaeism is called like the religion of two principles three times, or it's referred to that, in some texts and contexts, whatever. So what that basically means is, obviously there's two principles, good principle, bad principle, light and dark. And then there is the three times, which is essentially just beginning, middle, and end. So the beginning is essentially they're separate, okay, and the darkness or demonic realm, whatever you prefer, hell, is kind of warring within itself pretty much nonstop all the time, because what else do they have to do other than have war with each other, I guess. So what eventually happens is they end up sort of pushing the border of that war further and further out until eventually they accidentally discover the Father of Greatness and heaven and whatever, again, whatever terms you prefer. Um and from there, essentially, they're like, "Ooh, I want that." So they kind of attack it and try and basically take it for themselves. So essentially, the Father of Greatness is like, "Well, I can't let that happen, so I guess I'll go and fight them myself." So he creates these things, emanations, right? Which are essentially kind of like extensions of themselves. I like to describe them as like limbs because it's still him, it's still God, but it's like a different um incarnation or aspect, if you will. Like I said, it's like a limb. Like my hand is it's part of me, but it's a hand, if that makes sense. Um, so that's how I like to think of it. But he creates these different emanations, one of the first is the primal man. Um, and he essentially goes and he fights the demonic realm and kind of defends. But what ends up happening is he basically essentially sacrifices himself, which does is what essentially traps the light or kind of makes them commingle, light and dark, spirit and matter, kind of makes them commingle. And the reason why that's even something that had to be done was because of the fact that that essentially maimed the dark so that it basically it wasn't powerful enough to really do anything anymore. So it's still a threat and it's still actively doing bad, but it can't directly attack like the realm of light or anything anymore. And so essentially what the world and everything is it's made up out of matter which originated from the realm of dark. It's basically like, oh, there's some dead bodies and remnants there. Let's remake this into the world and everything in it, which conveniently kind of lines up nicely with the Big Bang if you want to incorporate that into your ideological structure there. You can easily just be like, oh, well, that's what the Big Bang was. It was them mixing together. Look at that. Crazy. But essentially the mother of life and the living's sometimes people call him the father of life, so we'll just go with that for simplicity. But essentially these two are the ones that create the earth and everything in it. Um, and essentially what the human body was not made by God. It was made in God's image, but it wasn't made by God. So essentially what ends up happening is the Prince of Darkness, or essentially the devil, right? He wants to trap the light. So what he creates is the body, and he essentially puts every sinful idea and thought and basically every evil into that body and sort of traps the light within it, which is just what Adam and Eve are. Um, so something else that's kind of interesting, I mentioned, how Adam and Eve were kind of different. So Adam was more like holy or whatever, and Eve was more sinful. I think that also can kind of reflect a certain disposition of people, like a predisposition to being a little bit more tolerant, lenient, holy, if you will, or the opposite. So I think that's generally the beginning stuff. The middle stuff would be like the current time. So with the prophets and whatever, which there were a lot of prophets other than just Mani. There's the four primary prophets, Mani, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus. Those are like the four big ones, which Jesus is also interesting because he's also the son of God, so it's kind of a confusing little thing there. Um, but yeah, so those are the four primary prophets, and then there's some other contemporary ones like Enoch, he's a prophet, Seth, Shem, uh, and others that I am not remembering right now, but there are plenty more. And that's like another reason why Manichaeism probably spread so easily is because of the fact that it was so variable and was able to incorporate so many, prophets and different ideologies into it that you could potentially get people from those faiths to convert to it. So that would be
and
like
it
the
was
middle.
all over the world. I mean,
Oh
it
yeah,
was
it was a world religion. Yeah,
yeah.
it's really sad because people just murdered it. But we'll get to that. But yeah, so the middle time would be now. Then, like I mentioned, it was murdered. So by like the 6th century in Rome, it was pretty much gone there. Um, but it survived. It peaked really in like the 10th to 12th century with the Uyghur Khaganate, which I don't know if you know what that is, but it was an empire, a Uyghur empire, and they made Manichaeism their state religion. So there's actually a lot of like texts and art fragments from that area, which, thank you. Thank you, Uyghurs. I appreciate it. Something that I thought was kind of funny is I read someplace that at one point there was a neighboring Muslim country that wanted to like essentially kill all the Manichaeans in that area, and this Uyghur country was like, listen, we have a lot of Muslims here, so if you do that, we're gonna get rid of all of them. We're gonna kill them. I thought that was kind of like it's not very Manichaean, ironically, but I respect it. So yeah, but that'd basically be the middle time up till now and whatnot. And interestingly, it was also kind of prophesied that the Manichaean texts and everything would be lost or destroyed, and that they would eventually come back, which is kind of what's happening now, which is also interesting. Um, but yeah, so that would be the middle. The eschatological aspect or the end would essentially be Christ comes back. Um, People start essentially leaving the world. There's people aren't reproducing anymore. They're being sort of separated. Things are kind of coming to an end, coming to a close. Slowly over time, people they leave, they die, whatever. They move on, they go to heaven and whatnot. And well, everything eventually burns for 1,468 years. Why it's that number? Couldn't tell you. Don't know why, but that's what it says. 1,468 years. So there's probably some meaning in there someplace, but I don't really know what it is. Um, but I think that's a generally good summation of, Manichaean theology.
So at that point, does life go completely extinct on the planet, or does it exist somewhere else other than this realm, or do we
So,
know? Yeah.
um, so that's kind of up for interpretation a little bit, but everything for sure goes to heaven. There's not like trapped by matter anymore, right? Um, so that's one thing is that nothing is trapped in the flesh anymore. So everything does eventually, get freed. It either ends up in heaven or, whatnot. But there's a couple different sort of interpretations because there's this thing called the new eon that's being built. Um, so what I think that is I think personally, my interpretation is that that's essentially a place where both, the different gods and people can like sort of coexist together without any sort of issue, I suppose. But that's being built as its own thing, and I suspect once that would be finished, then that's whenever, the end times would be triggered and whatnot. And something else is that the great builder is essentially creating what amounts to hell, or the bolos is what I've seen some other people call it, um, which is where the darkness would be trapped. Another contemporary, some kind of touchy subject in Manichaeism that I've seen a couple times, I've seen people debate it, um, is whether all the light gets saved, so every single soul, everything, or if some of it gets trapped in hell or in the darkness. So again, like I said, I like to sort of bridge these two opposing viewpoints. So my personal view would basically be that since there is evidence, you can find evidence of both, either everybody gets to heaven or some people go to hell and are stuck there forever. The way I interpret it is, since there is a hell, that's for sure. So what I personally think is, I think the worst of the worst do go there. Everything burns, because that does happen, eventually. And then whatever light was in there is sort of freed and purified from whatever evil, it was commingled with. That's my, I guess, apologetic to sort of make both work, where there is a hell and you can go to hell for quite a long time, until the end times, which is a while. And also, have everybody be saved in the end. So that's my personal interpretation.
So I hope I'm not jumping in an odd direction from here, but I hope that it's a good time to ask, what is the Ecclesia of Light? And can you tell me a little bit about, I mean, both what that is as a piece of the religion, but also as a group, an organization, this thing that
Right.
you've played a
Absolutely.
hand in building, and what is that history?
Okay, so whenever I first was interested in Manichaeism, I joined that Discord server you mentioned, right? And there wasn't really anybody there that identified as Manichaean or really helped me at all. I was like, can anybody like point me in the direction? Where do I look? Blah blah blah. Um, so that nobody really helped me there. So, I kind of just figured it out myself. But I bought a book. It's right there. Um, it's basically, it's about the Prophet Mani and his religion, and it's by Duncan Greenless. Um, it's older, but basically what he did was he took all these different texts and kind of pieced them together to try and make like one cohesive like storyline, I guess, if you want to say that. Um, and I really liked it. I was really like glad that I got this book. I was like, wow, this is great. But there was one thing that bothered me that I realized, and that was that these texts, they were put together. They weren't in their original form. So I was like, okay, but I want to read how it originally was. So from there, I started looking into different things, and I was finding, different texts, which are hard to find, but they're on the internet, really. If anybody wants to find them, you can. It's a pain in the butt, but you can do it. Um, but anyway, so I started finding those different texts, and I started like compiling them into my own little books, because I wanted to have my own copies of them. So, for instance, I have this. I created that, or this, and whatnot.
You self-published these translations
Yes,
or these
yes,
compilations? Wow. Yeah, please, can you show them again? I'd love to see
yeah,
a
sure,
little bit of detail. All right, we'll definitely put links to these below.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So I got like the Book of Epistles,
Brilliant.
Shabaragan, and the Chinese Manichaean text, which the Chinese ones I translated those myself. The other ones I just sort of compiled.
So
Um,
you read and speak Chinese?
no, I use
Oh, okay.
books and AI to help me with that.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Although that would be pretty cool if I could. But anyway, so I started compiling those texts, and I started sort of getting in contact with different people who kind of did self-identify as Manichaeans, but didn't really do anything because of the fact that they were, I mean, there wasn't really anything going on at the time, so nobody was really doing anything. But I sort of reinvigorated that because of my own interest. Um, so from there, just slowly building up the books and, whatever, which I'm currently working on another edition where I'm versing them this time. So that way you can be like, oh yeah, chapter blah 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 blah, verse 20 blah blah. So that's what I'm doing right now. And we've been like whatchamacallit, restoring the art, commissioning like restorations of those. So what the Ecclesia essentially is, well, it's basically that. It'd be like the modern Manichaean church. Um, but it doesn't really exist in like any sort of official church form, any sort of legal entity, I guess, except for the fact that I bought an LLC. So I own an LLC, Ecclesia of Light, and what that basically is for now is it's what I use for everything Ecclesia related. So for instance, those books, for a while they were just published under my own name and just like I was getting that money, not that I was making anything from it, but still, you know, but what I eventually did was I was like, okay, well, it kind of need it to be its own thing. So I published those books under the Ecclesia of Light or the art pieces, right? So right now I'm working on that website, which is basically done. I'm just working on the store now. Um, that is under the Ecclesia of Light, and then everything else kind of involved within that is also the Ecclesia of Light's like stuff. Um, so that's essentially what it is just mostly just for like making things a little bit more streamlined and cohesive rather than like, oh, this person's, he's got this and that, and this other person's got this and this. So that's what I'm working on. At this exact moment in time, I was messing with Printify, which was also a pain, um, and setting that up with Etsy so that we can sell the art. And then I'm going to connect that Etsy to the website so that that can be on the website. I was trying to do it differently, didn't work out, so that's the way I'm doing it now. So that's one thing that I'm almost done with. We're almost there. Hopefully I can finish that shortly, but yeah, that'd be essentially what the Ecclesia of Light is it's mostly working on the text and the art. What my goal eventually is to actually have a legitimate, like actual legally recognized church, and like an actual building, and everything. Because I think that Manichaeism could do a lot of good in the world. Um, since I think it's kind of can be a little bit of a dreary place, Um, but I think it can do a lot of good. So I would like to sort of reintroduce this community to the world, especially because like I think in particular, a lot of people who are like agnostic or atheist are just kind of disillusioned with their own religion. Um, I think to some extent that they haven't found something that works for them. I'm not saying this for everybody, obviously, but I do think that that is part of it because you don't hear about any other obscure religions. You just hear about like the same big ones like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever the big ones. Um, so I think that's part of it too, is there isn't really a variety compared to centuries ago when there were so many different ideologies and religions, and then they were all just kind of stamped out by what are now the big ones. So,
Well, you've put in a brilliant amount of work into all of this, and I think the publications are amazing. I mean, I was very impressed with both the subreddit and also the Discord. I mean, you kind of think, for what is a small group of people, not to see, daily posts and stuff, but it's like it's pretty active. I mean, there's people on there, they're talking, they're sharing stuff, and it seems like a very diverse group, which is very interesting. People kind of understanding this subject from a host of different in a host of different ways. And so yeah, it sounds like you've built a kind of an amazing network of people
I'm
and
really
a
happy.
hub,
Yeah.
like a database
Yes.
for this information. Incidentally, the artwork is so beautiful.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I've long been an admirer of the original pieces that we still
Hmm.
have. So it's nice to see them fully restored. If somebody were to be interested in purchasing some of these texts that did have some of the antinatalist kind of content that you mentioned, or is some of that work that you've already done translations of or made available?
Um, Let me see. If I were to look for that sort of stuff, I would probably guess in the Book of Epistles or the Shabaragan. Um, those are like the main things I could really think of, especially particularly that one text that, like I mentioned earlier, regarding Adam and Eve. That's in the Shabaragan. So I guess I would read through that and give it your own sort of interpretation. Um, but the Shabaragan and the Book of Epistles would probably be the best places to start because the Book of Epistles sort of it deals with more ethical stuff. And a lot of those letters are actually by Mani himself too. I think there's around 30. So, um, that would probably be one place to start, in the Shabargan, those two. I think those would have the most anti-natalistic, aspects within them.
So I recently just, I kind of went down the rabbit hole and found different YouTube channels, different people espousing this view from kind of with different flavors behind them. And I came across the videos of Cole Nelson, a
Mhm.
really fascinating guy, really fascinating videos, very
He's a great
kind of
guy.
intense speaker, very articulate person,
Yes.
had really interesting perspectives. And in one of his videos, he's addressing the subject of antinatalism specifically within
Mhm.
Manichaeism, and explaining the reasons why a Manichaean would not have a child. And
Mhm.
there's, in one of these videos, he just has this like amazing quote that I wanted to share and kind of get your perspective on.
When you have children in Manichaeism, right, you are involved in perpetuating the entrapment of light within the material creation or flesh. Children are not, entirely evil, right? There's light in them, there's goodness in them, but that is the part of the problem. You have encapsulated that light and goodness in flesh, in matter, such that that light and will experience suffering. As Manichaeans, we believe that the material world is the cross of light, and that the light within the world is also akin to the suffering Jesus, crucified everywhere on the cross of light. So to actually have children of your own, according to your flesh, is to engage in the ongoing crucifixion of Jesus.
Which is like just an amazing quote. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that statement, or if you could. I mean, I know you didn't say it, but I'm just saying if you have any thoughts on like how to expand on the meaning of that.
Yeah, so what he basically means is the light within the world, right? That is essentially equated with Jesus, because you remember how I mentioned the primal man, right? How he's like one of the first emanations. Well, he is essentially what Jesus Christ also is. It's complicated theologically, but it's essentially they're equated. So by him being trapped within, or parts of him being trapped within the world, Jesus Christ is also, trapped within the world. It's like the soul, that's kind of where it originates from. Not that everybody, is is Jesus. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, everybody's spirit or soul originates from heaven, or that, original source, I guess. So what he means by that too is, in Manichaeism there is a specific, very specific rule, and one of the main rules really is you are not supposed to hurt anything. Nothing at all. No humans, no animals, no plants, nothing. You're not supposed to hurt anything. And that's because of the fact that there is light within everything, that if you are hurting that, then you are essentially hurting, Jesus Christ. That's basically what that means. So there are two perspectives that you can kind of look at this from. So you can look at it from like, okay, well, by having children, I am trapping more light here in the world, and I am basically, like he said, crucifying um Jesus, the cross of light. So there's that perspective. Or there's the perspective of like, potentially, oh well, this kid can then go on to do good things. Which, by the way, I totally understand the anti-natalist perspective, because it's like, yeah, living sucks. It can suck. It can suck sometimes. So easier if you just, it didn't happen to begin with. But, you can view it from either lens.
Sorry about that. Well, no, thank you so much for your perspective on that. It really helps me understand sort of where he's coming from with that statement. One thing that I've wondered, and other people that I've spoken to have wondered, is it possible? I think this interview is maybe an example of it. In fact, that there's this newfound interest in Manichaeism and its connection to antinatalism, and at the same time, antinatalism, over the last 20 years has grown as its own presence. It
Hmm.
started out sort of very obscure. It is still very obscure, but its sort of presence in the world is growing, and I think that might uh, the interest in both of these things sort of may coincide, and they may sort of help one another, to sort of become more
Known.
known in the world. Do you see that as a good thing? Do you think that is there because I've noticed like a little bit on the Discord, just in the little bit of research I've done, like there is some sense that you get like contemporary antinatalism might be a bit of an intrusion into what Manichaeism is, because they are sort of two separate things. I mean, but there's definitely some shared structure there.
Values. See, the
Yeah.
interesting thing is, I mean, like, if an anti-natalist became a Manichaean, that wouldn't really conflict with Manichaeism, but also, that's not like a requirement either. So I could definitely see them being, you know, um, helpful to each other, and I could see that being a thing that can happen. And like I said, Manichaeism is a very adaptable religion, so it's essentially like, well, you like this aspect, right? Whoa, we got that and more. So, you can definitely, I could see that happening, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I've just always sort of wondered how they may play into each other's futures, because they clearly both sort of have futures. It seems like, and I could be entirely wrong. You'll have to correct me, but there are many sort of flavors of Manichaeism,
Yes.
um, and sometimes those divisions happen due to geography. Where the religion can be found in the world, the vast ocean of time,
Yes,
that has sort of
exactly.
separated all of these different iterations, but also the different versions, maybe, if I'm perceiving things correctly, have a different ideological bent from one another. So some are more Western Christian,
Yes.
Augustinian related. Some are
Yeah,
more
cool.
Buddhist. Some are more uh, something else. So
Yes.
am I correct in thinking that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
obviously Manichaeism, right, whenever it was
Mhm.
brand new, I'm sure that was a lot different than what exists now. Or even, like in the middle of its tenure, because there was actually one Manichaean schism, and this is something that I thought was interesting, right? So there was a Manichaean schism, and what ended up happening is eventually, like the church reunited. For a brief period, there were two archegos, which is not supposed to happen. Which archegos is like the leader of the church, like the Pope for Manichaeism. There's not supposed to be two of those, but that did happen for a little bit. So eventually that was resolved, though, whenever the next archegos came to be. It was just one again, just everybody reunited, so to speak. But what ended up happening, from what I understand, is one archegos would sort of make things a little bit more lenient, and then the next one would make things a lot more strict. And then the next one would make things a little bit more lenient, and then, so on and so forth. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But yes, you would be correct in saying that there's many different flavors, so to speak, of Manichaeism. Because, for instance, in Eastern Manichaeism, right, there was a lot more emphasis on like Buddha, and that term was used a lot more. Whereas in Western Manichaeism, there's definitely going to be a lot more emphasis on Christ, which obviously there was emphasis on Christ over there too, because he's a very pivotal figure in Manichaeism. But there were more Buddhist terms, is what I'm saying. Um, and then obviously Chinese Manichaeism now is very, very, very different. Um, so the Ecclesia of Light, right? It's meant to be a little bit more of an orthodox, so to speak, version of Manichaeism, um, more so than Chinese Manichaeism, which I do believe that it definitely is. Um, but the thing is to try and make all of these different flavors, so to speak, coexist and be fine, and not be separate things, because there's not a whole lot of Manichaeans, so being kind of their own separate things is kind of stupid. Which is why, like I said, I try and sort of make the different perspectives work together. Because in that case, then I can be like, okay, well, look, you believe this, they believe this. Here's how you can believe both, and it works. Um, so that's what I try and do, since I try and make sure there's as little division as possible. Um,
I think that's
and
smart. Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
obviously, there's still people that they're going to have their own sort of predispositions, like I mentioned, Cole, right? He's a lot more anti-natalist, but that's okay. And then there's somebody else who is one of the main people, so to speak. His name is Ryan. He has had children, so he's a lot less anti-natalist. So he doesn't really like the anti-natalism all that much. Um, so that's why I also like how I've explained things like specifically the elect have to be anti-natalist. They can't have kids. But if it was before, eh, it is what it is. Or for the hearers,
That's somewhat similar to atheistic antinatalism too. I mean, it's one of the most famous antinatalists in the world has 3 children. So it's people
Exactly.
find this kind of perspective at all different periods of life, and
Exactly.
sometimes you've had
Yes.
kids beforehand. So yeah, so please go on. So sorry.
No, no, absolutely fine. But that's sort of how I try and balance those things and I make it work, like, okay, yeah, you had kids. If you become an elect, then you can't have kids anymore. That's the deal there. Um, I think that's really the main thing. And like I said, I think the Ecclesia should not either endorse nor, be like, have kids, don't have kids, either or. I think it should just sort of be like, okay, well, this is the thing. They can't have children. They're exclusively anti-natalist. And then sort of leave it up for interpretation for the rest. Let them decide.
May I ask, like, in terms of your own Manichaeism, would you consider yourself? Is it more? Does it have more relationship to Christianity? Does it have more relationship with Buddhism?
So my flavor, so to speak, is what you're asking for. Okay. That's interesting because I have really no previous major religious affiliation. Um, I was baptized Lutheran. I was not really raised Lutheran. I was Lutheran, but I didn't practice. I honestly really didn't even spare God a thought that often now and then, Now and then I'd be like, huh, that's an interesting concept. And then move on and not think about it for a long time. So I only really started getting interested slash into religion whenever I was 17 and I heard that term Manichaean from Candide by Voltaire, and I started looking into it. So something that like Cole and Brian have both acknowledged is that my viewpoint is probably the most interesting because of the fact that I don't really have any sort of previous religious baggage. So my religion is just Manichaeism. I don't have Buddhist background or Christian background, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm only 20. So I didn't really have time to develop this other thing and then move on to the next thing. So when I got into religion, it was just Manichaeism. So, and then like Ryan,
Yeah.
he was very interested in a certain figure named Bardasian, which Monty actually wrote against, and we have fragments of that. So, Monty didn't like Bardasian, but Ryan does. So he comes from that background where he liked Bardasian a lot, and he was also Mormon and like other religions before that. So he has a lot more different, religious experience, so to speak, and then became Manichaean. So because of that background, that affects his view, his tint of Manichaeism. And then Cole, right? Cole came from a sort of a Catholic, Calvinistic, Augustinian background. So that affects his view of Manichaeism, his Manichaean tint. Um, so yeah, so it really just depends on the person. Um, I don't really know many other people that are like specifically just Manichaean. Like a lot of the people that I know have had experience with other religion before. So it kind of depends. I'm sure there will definitely be more people like me who are introduced to just Manichaeism and are just like, oh yeah, that's the one. This is it.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
but as of now, it kind of depends for a lot of people as to what their background was.
Yeah, again, jumping all over the place. But can you tell me a little bit? I mean, obviously, one of the reasons why the Manichaeans in the Chinese context are so secretive is because there's this long history of persecution.
Yes.
I mean, and even some Gnostic sects, like, I
The
know there's some.
Mandans.
Yes. Also, I mean, I know that there's some question as to whether the Cathars actually existed, but I mean, they if they did, they were genocided basically off the face of the planet. Um, so there's as far as I know, there is nowhere in the world today where Gnosticism is illegal, but there's still a lot of fear attached to it in some
Yes.
parts of the world at least. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit towards that, the persecution, the fear around it that still exists today, and sort of one thing I've always wondered that I've never really gotten a conclusive answer to is why. Like, is it the dualism? Is it the anti-procreation? What is it
So
that inspires so much fear in other people? Yeah.
let me see here. I have a few things to touch on. So first of all, I think that now is the perfect time for it to come back because of how much more religious freedom there is now, specifically in the United States and Europe in particular. Those are ideal, like ripe environments for it to spread and not be murdered. Crazy. Um, and then also the Cathars, you mentioned them. I actually know one Cathar. I just got into contact with one of them because he knows a few other ones. So I'm actually trying to get them to sort of, combine. So kind of funny that you mentioned them. But I do believe they existed just because there are texts and stuff that are there. So, you know, um, but I think really like the fear, sort of, so to speak, of these different religions is that they disrupted the power structure of the time. And the fact, for instance, specifically for Manichaeism, right? I can't speak so much for the others, other than, like I said, they were competition and they disrupted the power structure. But in regards to Manichaeism specifically, it spread a lot very quickly, and it spread alongside Christianity. It was concurrent, and for a while, Manichaeism actually considered Christians kind of like brothers in arms because they were also being persecuted. And then the Christians started persecuting the Manichaeans, and that changed. That wasn't the situation anymore. Um, but I really think that it's really just about the fact that it was this competing religion, and they had Jesus Christ in their religion, which took away some of the novelty from Christianity. They had Buddha in Manichaeism, which took away the novelty from Buddhism, and same with Zoroastrianism. So those religions, I think those religions in particular were very threatened because they were like, well, what the hell? You took our prophet. Um, so I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, well, no, the challenge to power structures, absolutely. I think we can definitely
Oh,
see
that one's
that.
absolute for sure.
For
That one's for
sure, for
sure.
sure. And one of the key figures of both the persecution, but also well, I wonder, Augustine of Hippo was an extremely important figure within Manichaeism for a whole host of reasons.
Unfortunately,
Yeah, and
I can't stand Augustine personally, but
I
he was.
thought I had an inkling that was probably your opinion. I recently wrote a book with the wonderful Finnish philosopher Matti Haira called
Mhm.
Anti-natalism, Extinction of the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. We
Yeah.
speak quite a lot about different Gnostic sects that had sort of anti-natalist thinking within them. Manichaeism was definitely included. We also talked about the
Mhm.
Ankratites, the Bogomils, the
Oh, I like the
Cathars.
Bogomils, yeah.
Yeah, they're
And
very
the
cool.
Cathars.
Yeah, yeah.
They're like
Um,
Manichaeism's little cousin.
so we say of Augustine briefly in the book. I'll just read a quick quote. He lived his entire Catholic life in dread of being branded a crypto-Manichaean, something that would have had dire consequences. So he, he was Manichaean. He used Manichaeanism. He sort of hid and he persecuted. He played a very large hand in what ended
Yes.
up happening to the religion. So answers to this are a bit obvious, I know, in some respects, but I'm sure it's a bit varied from person to person. How is Augustine of Hippo viewed by modern Manichaeans today? Is he seen as some kind of traitor or
Oh, I
otherwise?
call him a traitor all the time.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your
So,
feelings towards him. Yeah.
like I said, I call him a traitor. Like literally somebody will be talking about him. I'm like, oh, traitor. But anyway, Cole likes Augustine. And it's like, we shouldn't be so hard on him. I'm like, no, screw him, but whatever. So, but again, Cole comes from that Augustinian sort of background. So he's kind of sympathetic, and that's where he learned about Manichaeism to begin with. And in that respect, I respect Augustine for the fact that he did save a lot of Manichaean texts. Considering he hated Manichaeism so much, he saved a lot of them. Like the
Yeah.
fundamental epistle of Mani, he saved that. The Bishop Faustus, he saved his whole treatise. I love that treatise, by the way. I literally went through his own Augustine's writing, and I took only that part, the stuff Faustus wrote, and put it together. I was like, I don't care what Augustine has to say. I just want that guy. But
Yeah,
anyway,
but he did preserve a
yeah,
lot of the text. I mean, a lot of what we know about the religion comes from him.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So I respect Augustine in that regard. Otherwise, eh. But like
Fair
I said,
enough.
he played his part. He happened. He saved some stuff. It sort of worked out, I guess. He'd be rolling in his grave, but it worked out. I personally am going to be so. Here's a project I'm going to be working on. So I'm going to be writing a little book, right?
Oh
And
yeah, show me.
I'm excited. I don't have anything quite yet, but I have notes. But I will be writing because there are a few particular topics that I want to write about. I'm going to write about the Old Testament in Manichaeism because the Old Testament is another touchy subject. In general, Manichaeism does not accept the Old Testament as scripture, but it can be used, and I'll explain why. But what I'm going to be doing is I have a list of different polemical writers against Manichaeism. Augustine is number one on that list. So I'll be writing against Augustine and every other Christian polemic against Manichaeism. And then I will continue on through all the Islamic polemicists and everything else. And then at the very end, I'm going to talk about some of those contentious subjects I mentioned within Manichaeism. I'm going to talk about those and explain those and how you can make both work. And I'm excited for this because there hasn't been any sort of major Manichaean work in like 600 years. So that'll be pretty cool. But basically, what I'm going to be doing is I am going to be getting revenge, so to speak, for all the Manichaeans that were murdered and didn't have the chance to write against these polemicists. So I'm going to do it for them, for every single one of them. So I'm
Brilliant.
excited for
That's
that.
that's a giant project.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to take me a long time. But did you know St. Thomas Aquinas wrote against Manichaeism?
Yes, I did actually.
Yeah,
I did.
I didn't know that. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. I just discovered that, and I was like, yes, I get to write against Aquinas. Um,
Nice.
so I'll be writing against all of them, and I'm gonna have fun doing that because, yes, and they're all gonna roll over in their grave. They're gonna hate me, but it's okay.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, that you have a tremendous number of huge projects on the way. What else lies in store um for you, for Manichaeism, for all the projects you want to do? And what does the future, look
So
like?
one of the things that I want to get done is you've seen the art that we've restored, and I would like to restore every single piece of art that there is, every fragment, every scrap. I want to restore it. Um, because I want to make a new book of pictures, which is a book that was lost for it's been lost for a long time. It hasn't existed, or at least a copy of it hasn't existed, or an edition or anything. So I would like to take every single scrap of Manichaean art and put it back together into a new book of pictures, and I'll probably use different Manichaean texts to sort of support it, I guess, as well. So that's one project. Like right now, I'm working in particular on the website. I'm working on versing all of the different Manichaean texts so that you can quote them easier. Um, I'm gonna write that book. Those are my main big projects, and I'm also going to personally go out and proselytize. So that'll be interesting. Hopefully, I don't get murdered, but it's okay. I'm gonna make little flyers and stuff and talk to people and see how that goes. But anyway, so I will personally be doing that. I'm gonna write that book, and what I'm gonna do with that book is after I write it, I'm going to go to those people of those various religions that I'm basically going to be writing against, And I'm going to give it to them and I'm going to be like, hey, I wrote this about your religions. You should respond to me and kind of get a discourse going. Because by doing that, they're going to inadvertently introduce people to Manichaeism. So it's a win-win for me. I don't care. I'll gladly debate you. Just, talk about Manichaeism. Go spread the word. Um, so basically, I'm going to use the other religions against those religions so that they go and spread my religion. So
Big plans. And in the meantime, you also have a YouTube channel, right? And then there's
yes.
also a Patreon. Do you want to shout that out at all?
So the Patreon is not quite ready yet, but
Okay.
it will be soon. I'm hopefully gonna get that done within the week. Hopefully. But I'll give you links and stuff to all that if you'd like.
Sure.
There's nothing on the Patreon, but it exists.
Well,
There will be stuff, I swear.
we love translations. We love art restoration on this channel. This there's been quite a lot of that in various
Yes.
interviews. So always happy to support that for sure. So yeah, please do.
I've recently started talking to somebody else. They have a website called Other Gospels. They translate different texts and post them in the public domain for
I think
people
I've
to
seen that
use.
actually. Yeah.
Great website. She's really cool. But anyway, so I've started sort of talking to her and working with her a little bit. So that's something else, is that we're kind of collaborating since we both generally have similar goals anyway. So there's that, which they also have a Patreon. So if you're interested in that, go check that out, I guess. I'll send you links to all this stuff. And then my Patreon, what I'm going to be doing with it is I'm going to be making these essentially free courses that you can download, and I'm going to put these on the website store too, so you can just get them there for free and you don't have to pay for the Patreon. So I'm going to make these free courses, which are going to essentially explain different aspects of Manichaeism that are a little bit more specialized. So I have a little list here. So church practices, that's like one of the main ones, a sort of catechism, the church structure, because that's like it's really specialized knowledge. Most people don't really need to know that, but if you want to, I'm going to make a course about it so you can go look at that. I'm going to make a course on the different holidays, Manichaean holidays, the Hearer and the Elect guidelines, which that'll probably pair with the church practices, and then something on the cosmology/theology, beginning, middle, end, like I explained here. So I'm going to make those courses, and I'm going to make those for free. And then also for the what was I going to say? Oh yeah, the Patreon. I'm going to have those all be on the Patreon, and I'm also going to post different writings that the Ecclesia has itself written. And by that I mean like different members of it. So for instance, one of us have written a Bema like manual, which Bema is one of Manichaeism's like main festivals. It's commiserating Mani's death. So that's like a week-long fast and whatnot. But anyway, so he wrote like a guide for that. He's also written a guide for how to do confession when there's no elect, which is also important. And then I wrote a whole, I think it was a Sunday liturgy, which took me forever. And then I never wrote any other ones because it took me forever. So I was like, okay, I did my part. I'll make more later if I need to. So I'm thinking, since we have a lot of those types of little like, oh, somebody wrote this, somebody made that, I'm going to post those on the Patreon, since those aren't really things that are like, oh, it's an original text, I really need to subscribe to the Patreon for this. I'm just, because those are kind of cool little things that people have made now, and kind of are relevant, but like not like, oh, I need to have it to understand Manichaeism. I've also tried to put like more free texts on the website, although that'll be kind of time consuming, and I'm not about to put all of them because it's a lot. But I am trying to put at least, some text on there. And then the person I was talking about, Other Gospels, right? I'm going to give her like the Chinese Manichaean texts and other stuff so that she can put those on her website and they can be there for free. And other stuff like translating more text and whatnot. So that's a lot of the stuff that I have focused on right now.
Brilliant. And am I wrong? Maybe I'm mistaken, but am I wrong in thinking that you have like a weekly events, right? Or sermons? Or
Oh yeah. We know we meet it weekly. So usually what it ends up being is, like a prayer to reading some text, and then usually kind of me explaining different Manichaean concepts and kind of just, answering questions. That's usually what ends up happening, or it's just kind of an open discussion, really. But yeah, so like every Sunday we do meet up in like the server, and then also there's one on Google Meet, which is like earlier in the day. Sometimes I make that one, sometimes I don't, because sometimes I'm asleep. So like today. So so it kind of depends. But yeah, so we do meet up weekly too.
I mean, have you thought about taking this into academia in any kind of way? I mean, do you have an interest in doing sort of professional research in that kind of sense?
Maybe. So I'm in college right now. So the university I'm going to transfer to, which I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to dox myself. Uh, but the university I'm going to be transferring to, I'm going to double major in psychology and religious studies. So sort of, maybe.
Yeah, that's great.
Depends. I'm not super interested per se in the academic aspect. I'm really just focused on the religious aspect, and that's my main focus. But I would work with scholars if they ever, wanted me to, or asked me, anything of that sort. If they needed my help for whatever, I absolutely would. I've actually talked to a scholar or two about Manichaeism, and that interview is also on the internet. So if you want, I can send you that too. But yeah, so like I would, not super like, oh, I'm gonna go out of my way to do that, but I would.
All right, brilliant. Well, Oscar, I mean, just, it's an incredible amount of work that you've done building a contemporary Manichaean movement. It's just, it's very unexpected to find. And like I said, I think you've given us a window into a different, even though antinatalism or antinatalist-like thinking is only a piece of this, it's still a type of antinatalist or anti-procreative
Yes,
thinking that is
absolutely.
vastly unexplored, vastly unknown,
Absolutely.
very, very unique towards, next to the other forms of antinatalism that can be found, on this very channel. So I want to
Yes.
thank you so much, for
Absolutely.
allowing us to take this peek into it. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much, Oscar. Thank you so much for being my guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I'll definitely be watching what you do in the future. And well, let me ask this before we close out, though. Where can people find you on the internet, and how can people best support what you're doing?
So there's my website, right, which is right now still kind of under work, but the link is Manichae.com right now. I'll probably add in more domains and make those also lead to it, but that's the main one right now. If you want to support me, buy some of the art on Etsy. There you go. Hey, you get art, I get like $5. That'll go to commissioning more art eventually. That's all that money is going to. Somebody gives me money, it's going to the art. It's just so nobody's making any money off of this. And even if we were, it would just be going back into Manichaeism. So I just want to acknowledge that and just make it known that if I was in this for money, I would not be doing this. I'd be doing something else because this is not the way to get rich. But anyway, so if you really want to support me, just go on Etsy, check out the Patreon whenever that's more set up and established, and that's the main stuff. And if you want to convert to Manichaeism, hey, even better. That's like the ultimate way to support it. There you go. Or if you just want to help research and whatnot, you can always get in contact with me. I'll always generally respond to messages unless I have some exclusive reason not to, which I don't know why I would, but so yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Oscar. And links, a ton of links will be below, so please, everybody, go explore them. And once again, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an honor.
Hey everybody, it's Amanda. Are you looking for an excellent way of making academic antinatalist works more available across the globe? I know I am. And so I'm delighted to announce that the wonderful and award-winning Polish publishing house,
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego,
which over the last 2 years has produced some exceptionally beautiful Polish editions of both original works like
Anti-natalism
by
Mikołaj Starzyński,
as well as classic academic antinatalist works like David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, has now opened an online shop featuring the magnificent antinatalist Ouroboros designed by
Michał Dziadkowiec.
The logo is fully customizable and available on a wide variety of products. Proceeds from all sales at the shop go directly towards the translation, production, and publication of more Polish editions by
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego.
What a perfect way for the antinatalist community to help assist an amazing company doing such important work, making more antinatalist academic works more widely available. Link below!
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego.
The most dangerous idea in the world. That she will not have children. That he is not allowed to spread his sperm into outer space. Is not a bioethicist who questions the value of human life itself like a physicist who denies the existence of cause and effect, or a theologian who denies the existence of God?
In his recent essay, Bioethics and the Value of Human Life, philosopher and bioethicist Matti Haira answers this question. Absolutely, definitely, maybe. He also distinguishes between bioethics with and without a hyphen, bio-utilitarian Thanatos ethics, and a newcomer among ethical theories of value, oib ethics. You heard that right. Bioethics spelled backwards. Bioethics and the Value of Human Life by Matti Haira on the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics. Out now, totally free, open access. Go check it out. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Exploring Antinatalism can also be heard on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, and so many other platforms. You can email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Website designed by Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com and follow him on Instagram. Logo art by Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube and check out his shop on Etsy at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Music by Matti Hairi. You can hear the whole song, Life is a Sexually Transmitted Disease with a Mortality Rate of 100%, by following the link in the description, and make sure to also read his academic paper which inspired the song, If You Must Give Them a Gift, Then Give Them the Gift of Non-Existence, in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics on cambridge.org. Links below. All the best, and bye for now.
Life is no thrill compared to nil. Life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw the right conclusion. Let them be still.